glad to be able to be here and moderate the panel for cybersecurity on the board of directors. Whether you're a board of director or not, we will absolutely add value and knowledge, and you'll have some good takeaways, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it was great to have Peter and to follow that, because a lot of the things that they were talking about, we're going to be able to add on, and it's a great segue for what some of the things that we're going to be talking about. So some of the goals and takeaways for this session is going to be a better understanding of the board responsibilities and duty of care, as well as an idea of what constitutes reasonability pertaining to cybersecurity and privacy associated with the roles that the board and the senior executives play. So one of the things that as the previous one, which was very exciting to see, that was extremely interactive. So we would love that same interactive, and to be able to answer those questions on the fly. So don't wait to hold your questions. Just go ahead and ask them so we can be interactive and do that throughout the entire panel session. So I get the dubious distinction of being able to introduce the different panel members. Some of them, all of them are actually good friends, and I'm going to start off with Mary Dickerson. She is the Vice President and Vice Chancellor of Information Systems and CISO for University of Houston, and also got her MBA from the University of Houston. And Mary, I am if I can do this, fellow Coug. So I graduated in '91 with an MIS degree, and I love U of H, and I love all the things that y'all are doing. You have taken it to such a different level than when I was there, and it's a Tier 1 university, and very excited to be a part of that.
Absolutely. It's fun to be part of the Cougar community, and definitely part of the Houston region adds spirit to our challenges. So thank you very much, George. I'm happy to be here and interested in participating in this discussion.
Great. Well, thank you for being here. And our next panelist, Elizabeth Rogers, she is instrumental in our board and what we do here. She's a partner of privacy and cybersecurity for Michael, Best, and Frederick LLP, and knows everything there is to know about privacy and cybersecurity. And she leads her group on those things, and she really helps her clients understand what their implications are, what the responsibilities are, what their duty of care is, and all sorts of things. So welcome.
Thank you so much, George. Hi, Mary, and happy Cybersecurity Awareness Month to everybody. I think we're ready.
Yeah, well, with this panel, you will definitely be ready. Our last panelist is JColvin. He's been a friend of mine for quite a while. He's been in cybersecurity, he says 30 years, but it's not quite 30 years. It's close to 30 years. And then for whatever reason, not only did he have this vast background in cyber and security, but Joel decided to get a law degree so he can then actually make comments on the legal perspective of cyber as well. And that was about 5 years ago, Joel. And you're also on the OSACA board, right?
Yes. Thank you, George. Yeah, many of my friends, when I told them I was going to law school, the response was, "What for?" But yeah, it was in order to tie my two favorite subjects together.
Well, that's a great combination for sure. So, and I'll do a quick introduction for myself. I'm George Crawford. I'm the CIO and CISO for a group called Catapult Energy Services. It's a private equity-backed company, and we're in oilfield services, which, as everyone knows, oilfield services right now is kind of the redheaded stepchild of Wall Street, but we're doing everything we can to continue to move forward and do the best we can with what we're given. So, again, to the panel, thank you very much for being a part of it. And also wanted to make sure that everyone knew that Mary and Elizabeth are both, as well as I, were on the different council for Houston Cybersecurity Task Force. So, which is, I'm sure you've already been told this throughout the day, but we are an ISAL, which is basically a fancy way of saying that we are to part information to the community about cybersecurity and what their responsibilities are, and help businesses be better equipped to handle that and to understand what their responsibilities are. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump in. And I did not tell any of the panelists this, so we're going to go ahead and jump in with a few questions. One of the question is, and I'm going to start with you, Mary. How long have you lived in Houston?
Oh, goodness. So I've lived in Houston for over 25 years. We currently live down in the Clear Lake area, so we are enjoying the tropical side of Houston.
Okay, great. Well, I have another question for you. But I'm not going to give it away yet. So, Elizabeth, how long have you been in Houston?
I actually am from Houston, but I have not been back there since about 1999. However, everything that prepared me for who I am today started either in Alvin, Texas, right outside of Houston, or within the city of Houston, where I started my law practice.
Okay, well, we'll count that as a native Houstonian.
Okay, thank you.
Joel, how long have you been in Houston?
I moved to Houston in 1988 and then went back and forth between Houston and Dallas and Houston and Dallas. And so this is my third time in Houston. I can't.
Okay, well, we
can't
call
go away.
Dallas the northern continent, right? So, okay, so the next question, and Elizabeth, you get to go first. What is your favorite barbecue place in Houston?
Oh my gosh. I'm drawing a blank because it's been so long. I can tell you some places in Austin, but that wouldn't count. So I'm going to let someone else go.
Okay, so as everyone can tell, these were not prepared questions. So, Joel, your favorite barbecue place?
Probably Rudy's. That's the one I go to more often.
I actually think I've had Rudy's with you before, and yes, it is great. So, Mary, yours favorite barbecue?
So I'll have to say I'm part of a volunteer fire department, and we do barbecue at the fire department. So I'd have to go with them. It's not really a commercial venture, but it's the best barbecue I've ever had. So, but George, wait a second. You didn't answer either the first question or this question. So I think it's only fair that the moderator participate in these spur of the moment questions.
Now you know why Mary's on the panel, because she's very sharp. And so, okay, well, I've been here my whole life. I grew up in Houston, and my favorite barbecue place. Oh, I'm not prepared for this either. But I would have to say Papa's Barbecue. So
good choice.
That would be mine. Thank you, Mary.
So for all of our participants, this would be the joy of live streamed video content.
There you go. That's it. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and jump in, and from the things that Peter and Umesh were talking about, I think that the segue is really good, because a lot of the different things we're going to be talking about will be valid for whether you're a board of director or not. Understanding what those responsibilities are for the board of directors is very important. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in with the first topic, and then and again, we'd love it to be interactive, and if this goes through kind of a different course or different thread because of the questions that come up, that's awesome. So we want to make sure we provide the most value to you guys out there watching us. So the first question is going to be, how do we help the board of directors understand what they're accountable for individually? So that's a lot of different important areas to discuss, and way too many topics for this. But when we talk about individual board liability, duty of care, responsibility of effort, audit responsibility, and cyber oversight, there's so different many of these that we need to help them understand. So where do we start? How do we help them understand to prioritize those? So who wants to jump in and grab that one?
I will, if you like.
Go.
I can give you a really short version of the duties of the board that I think applies to all the different areas that the board's responsible for. And that is that they need to be informed and or get informed about what's going on with the company. They need to exercise oversight, and they need to know what the compliance and disclosure requirements are. And those three main areas apply to all the different kinds of decisions where the board is trying to evaluate what kind of risk the company is under. And when you apply that to a cybersecurity standpoint, that means, do you understand what the company is doing as it relates to cybersecurity. Do you have any kind of independent assessment of that? Have you gone back and reviewed how they're doing things? That's the exercise oversight. And then are you familiar with the, I just saw one of the comments, but are you familiar with the compliance and disclosure requirements? So sometimes a board member has to tell other board member things. Sometimes the board has to tell the company executive management things. And sometimes they need to make sure things are reported up to regulatory agencies like the SEC. And so if you don't know what any of those are, get somebody to come in and advise the board and help you with that and deal with that from cybersecurity as well as the other areas that you already deal with. And that's not a dead cat on my desk. It's just sunning in the light there. I forgot she was in here.
So that's awesome. And I think that's really important for us to understand. But as the senior executive team, for those of you that are out there that actually talk and communicate with the board, understanding these things is really important. So you can help coach them and help them understand some of the responsibilities. So that'll kind of prep you for the things that you need to be able to provide them with from an informational perspective. But Joel, when you were saying that, one of the things that came to mind is reasonability. And I know that that's a big term for a lot of us. And for the board, you hear that all the time. As long as it's reasonable in the efforts that you make, that gives you a lot of coverage. So Elizabeth, what do you think about reasonability?
Sure. In fact, I wanted to agree with everything that Joel said. And also, just before answering your question, make sure everybody knows they can go to cyberhouston.org and click under the tab for resources and look at the cybersecurity guide for board directors that we prepared starting back in 2015, just as an after conference resource. Make a note to do that. We're revising the third version, currently the 2020 version, which will be available online after the conference. But George brings up a great point. For most businesses in the US, there's not a prescriptive requirement for companies as far as cybersecurity hygiene. The standard that's prevailing in 2020 is what is a reasonable cybersecurity program. So with this in mind, most executive teams should consider including board awareness and oversight of cybersecurity as part of their overall reasonable cybersecurity program, borrowing from some of the key concepts in the GDPR and the California Consumer Privacy Act that just went into effect this year. So, for example, 2 years ago when the GDPR went into effect, companies had to adopt to the concept of accountability, making a written justification for all the decisions and steps they're taking to create an adequate, reasonable cybersecurity program. And this aligns with the responsibility to be accountable for outside auditors as well. 2 weeks from today, all of us will be voting, but if we haven't already, but in California, they will be voting on an expansion of the California Consumer Privacy Act, which includes a requirement that all businesses subject to that act adopt a reasonable cybersecurity program. That is going to be a mandate from the board down. So for businesses that are not subject to either one of those, federal regulators and states attorneys general have suggested there is a minimum duty of care for board members and other fiduciaries to exercise cybersecurity oversight. All of this works together to pose the question to the board, or the board poses a question to the executive leadership. What have you done this quarter? What is the state of our cybersecurity? Have there been any policies updated, and why? Has the incident response plan been updated to account for any threats to our company's data? So each each company is going to be evaluated on their own particular circumstances under this standard of reasonableness, George. So it's not just something that's in the GDPR or the CCPA, but the FTC also looks to companies to determine whether they did what was reasonable under their own particular circumstances.
Okay. Yeah, Elizabeth, it's so much, right? There are so many different attributes and so many different things that the board is going to be responsible for. And when we approach the board and we talk to them about these things, it's really important that we can help them understand what those risks are and what the things that they need to understand are and what our role is in communicating. So, when we talk about that, communicating to the board, right? So as individuals, when we go, whether we're the CIO or whatever role in executive management we are, and we have to go and we have to talk to the board and help them understand their responsibilities and interact with them. There's a lot of things like the what do we communicate, but also how do we communicate to the board to be effective and to be able to help them understand and realize what their responsibilities are. So, Mary, do you have thoughts on that, on what and especially how we communicate to the board?
Sure, absolutely. So I think it's important, whether you're talking directly to the board or you're preparing documentation and things that will end up going to the board, and you're just talking to your management or executive management, that it's important that you talk their language. And the reality is especially as a technologist, we tend to look at the details and get into the nitty gritty, down in the weeds of some of the technology aspects. But the reality is that's not what the board is looking for. The board is looking for strategy. They're looking for high level. They're looking for an understanding of the risks that are involved, but at a very high level. So the analogy that I like to use is with financial statements. So the board needs to know, are we operating at a profit? Are we operating at a loss? What are the key indicators and the drivers that are moving us in a financial perspective one way or the other? Same thing is true from a technology perspective. And in case of like the financial world, the accountants are not preparing a debit and credit sheet to take to the board to say, and these are the number of transactions that we did last month, and here are the transactions that went negative, and here are the transactions that were positive. They're not doing those things. Instead, they're talking trends, they're talking high level, they're talking about the risks that are associated with the bulk of the transactions, but not the individual transactions themselves. However, from a technology perspective, we tend to go in saying, and these are the number of systems that we have with vulnerabilities, and these are the ways that, we dealt with this particular incident. The board's not interested in that. They're looking at big picture. So think about that when you are communicating with the board, and give them the information in the way that they are looking to receive it. Give them the trend information. Give them the high level things, and piggyback off of stuff that that they're already aware of. When things hit the media and there are all these news stories that talk about this data breach or that data breach, put it in terms that the board can understand. And here are the ways in which we are similar to this particular company. And here are ways that we are very different from this particular company, and give the board the yardstick by which to measure the risk as it pertains to your organization. That's what the board is interested in, and that's what executive management is interested in if you're not talking directly to the board.
Oh, that's perfect. Elizabeth, I see you shaking your head. Do you want to add to that?
Oh, right, because I think for me, I also need to learn. I learned as a lawyer what language I needed to speak when talking to technologists such as yourself and Mary. I had to learn the vocabulary. I had to learn how to translate that into what kind of risk are they talking about, so I can put myself exactly in the position that Mary is advising by learning that language. It's so helpful.
Yeah, agreed. So I'll give a really brief story. My first time because as a CIO, you always want a seat at the table, right, with the board, to be able to communicate at that level, because it's a business impact. It's not, and I've always said it's not about technology, it's about business. So once you understand the business, then you can understand how to apply technology, but the whole thing is about business. So real briefly, the first seat I got at the table with the board of directors, and I'll say this up front. So there's something called a 3-second glaze which I don't know how many people are familiar with that. But my first seat at the table, I went in and I was very excited. It was back in 1993 with Allied Waste's board, and I was the VP of IT. So I went in and they asked me about technology, and I started telling them exactly what Mary was saying. I said, oh, well, these great things about this technology, and we can do this and that and whatever. And I was talking technology terms, and I lost them in the first 3 seconds. That glaze came over them. They started looking at their phones. They didn't pay any more attention. And I'm going, okay. So very much to what Mary was saying is so true. It's not necessarily what you communicate, although that's very important. It's how you communicate and speaking their language, talking about risk mitigation, talking about operational leverage, talking about EBITDA, which is a fancy way of saying what is the company worth and what's the cash flow and what can we afford to pay for this company. Those are the real critical things. So Joel, I see you down there. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I don't know if you remember, George, I used to use this phrase a long time ago, but when they get that deer in the headlights look, I used to always ask people, you ask them, did they understand? And I used to often say, well, they're about 3 or 4 light deer away from understanding. And the point is not to glaze their eyes over. If you have, you're not putting things in terms that they need to understand. And I know IT people want to get right into the details, but you really have to work hard to make sure that you're talking about it in terms that the board understands, which is, of course, what we're talking about here. They want to know what's important for the company to go forward. What kind of risk do they need to be dealing with? How many cats do they have on their desks?
So yeah, I think that, and I saw one comment go by about the what we say or how we say it is more important than what we say. And someone said something about Krispy Kreme donuts, which was a great comment. So we love those comments, and please continue to ask questions and add your comments so we can be in the moment. A lot of times when you wait until later, you forget about the things that were relevant at that particular time. So please, ask the questions, and we'll stop and we'll answer them. I don't know if we've actually missed anyone. Oh, I see one right now. Pinkerton barbecue is the best. So I think that was a little while before. But so one of the things that we talked about was on the responsibility, we were saying, the board should ask about the state of cyber reports. How often should they get those? What should be included? But really, when we go to the board, and once we learn the language and how to communicate with the board, what questions should the board be asking us as leadership teams? Because when I'm at the board level, and now hopefully after people review and we help them understand what their responsibilities are, what is reasonableness, they're going to have questions to ensure that they're complying with that. So what are those questions that the board should be asking their leadership team?
I have something to start with, mainly because I know a lot of the focus this morning or this afternoon has been on how do we talk to the board. And really, the liability is going to be with the board members, or the board itself. So the board really needs to know how to talk to us, or to technologists such as yourself and Mary. And I think that's where there's a big hole in what kind of advice the board is getting before they talk to the information security team. And so it's helpful to have a coach for the board to know how to talk to key stakeholders in the company. And they should be asking questions like, how are you evaluating our vendors? What types of assessment are you taking them through? What have you spent in the past quarter or the past year? And what are your plans for the year ahead as far as what we need to comply with the law? In my opinion, there should be a designated member on the board who's the cybersecurity officer, who is the person that stays the most up to date with trends. And therefore, that person would ask the staff, have you updated the cybersecurity incident response plan to account for the ransomware, the kinds of sophisticated ransomware. And that person should also be on the incident response team and be the go-to person on the board with the main accountability, and lead the board in developing even new questions at every meeting. And I'll stop there because I know my colleagues have other great ideas.
So actually, I'd like to piggyback to something that Elizabeth mentioned at the very beginning of our panel, and that is that there are resources available on the Cyber Houston website designed to answer some of these very questions. So in addition to the board brief that explains some specific questions that the board should be asking to try to be able to properly assess the security program that is in place for that organization. That also ties in with our cybersecurity assessment that is also available online. So for the technologists that are attendees today, you can go into that assessment and you can self-assess how your program is doing in different areas as far as not only the tasks that you're doing, but also the maturity of those tasks. And you come up with a score that kind of tells you where you fall as far as being prepared. The good thing is that also dovetails with the board brief in that when the board comes to you and asks you those specific questions designed to assess your program, you can also tie that back to the hygiene assessment that you have done yourself. So those items tie together. So you'll have the details to back up what will hopefully be a very strategic answer back to the board on those 10 questions as far as overall, here is how the program is performing, and here are some specific initiatives that we will be working towards in the future. And so that provides that holistic view of your program from both the technology perspective, but also the strategic perspective that the board is looking for. And all of those resources are available on the Cyber Houston website.
So, Mary, you bring up a really good point, and I agree with everything Mary just said. What I'd like to add on to that is, when you say, measurement, how are we doing? What are those metrics? How do we give the board a report card on a regular basis? We have the state of cyber reports, which is one way, but how do we give them a report card that tells them how well we're doing, the investment that they're making, and what the return on investment is? How do we apply those metrics? How do we determine what those are?
So I'm going to give the standard IT security answer, which is it depends.
Are you a consultant?
Lawyer answer as well.
Not yet. It depends. And it's very, it gets really back to your board and what are the metrics that matter to your board? How are they looking at other areas of the company to evaluate effectiveness? If there is a certain standard that they use and a certain comparison across all the different business units, you want to see how you can modify that standard to apply to cyber as well. Again, getting back to you want to speak their language. The more different you are, the more, number one, it could be confusing, but also the less effective you can be, because they're now trying to compare apples and oranges. They already probably have a sense that I don't get technology, so I don't understand this. So the closer you can get to what they're seeing in other areas, the more likely they are to, number one, understand it, number two, embrace it, number three, be able to ask intelligent questions back to you as far as how they should use that information as part of their overall strategy.
I'd like to add, when you're doing that, think of the point of view of a board member who's not an IT person. If you, for instance, you're talking about a risk assessment, and they might know to ask, when was our last risk assessment? They may not be able to read such a risk assessment. So if you're doing a presentation to the board, focus on, we had a risk assessment May of this year. Their recommendations were these kinds of things in general categories. And we've decided to implement these for these reasons. And we've decided that these other recommendations don't apply to us for these reasons. And that's how it affects our company's ability to do whatever the company is doing. I remember years ago, this is one of my favorite stories. I went to do a presentation at Pizza Hut Corporate. And I went for a couple of them, and I don't know if they still do this, but they always ended a meeting. If somebody came in to talk about something, they said, well, that's nice. How does this help us make more pizzas? And if you think about the presentation from an IT security standpoint, you're trying to show the board how is it that you're going to help whatever your company does through the technology that you use, or how are you going to help protect the company through the risk that you have to take just by the sheer nature of technology. And if you're not couching those answers, your presentation in that way, you're going to start getting that glass look over their eyes, because they're not sure of all the things you said, how does this apply to what we're doing? And so think of it from their standpoint. What is their goal? Gauge your presentation toward that.
Yeah, and real briefly, I'll add to that. So a lot of the things, obviously, from a board perspective, when we speak their language, is on the valuation of the company. What's the return on investment associated with that, and what is in it for the stakeholders that are part of that organization? So, Joel, what you said is spot on. And that's why it's so important to, the more and more that you can look at yourself as a revenue center versus a cost center, and then the more you can communicate that to the board, the more value that you create, the more attention you get, and the more investment in your organization from a technology perspective. Because, and again, being a CIO or a CISO or being in technology, it's not about technology at all. It's about the business, what we can do to enable the business to create competitive advantage. So, Mary, you have something?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to add something to that. So for those of us that are in academia or in the nonprofit side of the world, it may not be that revenue is the most important thing to your particular organization. So friendly amendment is figure out what the mission of your organization is and make sure that you are in alignment with what those key objectives are. And for most corporations, you're absolutely right, it is revenue. But for those of you that it's not revenue, it's important for you to figure out what that is and make sure that you are in close alignment with what the organization is trying to achieve, and then make sure that you're tying each of your cyber objectives to what the organization is accomplishing.
And that is a great point. And being in private equity, we would never think of something that's not on a revenue perspective, but that is a great perspective, and I think that's absolutely spot on. So, Elizabeth, do you have something?
Well, I think that also to Mary's point, without regard to whether you're for-profit or nonprofit, all organizations are subject to regulatory action and a lawsuit following a data breach, right? So even before all of these standards have arisen and regulations and laws were enacted beginning around 2015, there's a real value in taking reasonable steps to protect data. Number one, from a competitive advantage, if U of H does it better, then we won't mention the competitive college, then I'm gonna go there. Or from the standpoint of any business, in front of a court or in front of the Attorney General, we can show those judges that starting in January of 2020, we delivered this report. We also responded to the board's request for follow-up. The board followed up with the statements that people such as you, George, or Mary say. They asked, did you have this risk assessment taken in June? So keeping on monitoring and maintenance of the reasonable cybersecurity program will translate into lower fines and lower penalties. And I don't think that if the standard were perfect security, we would all be in trouble, right? But the fact that it's reasonable security allows us to show the regulators and the arbiters we've done what is reasonable, and it should mitigate much of any liability after a breach.
Yeah, and go ahead, Joel.
Yeah, I was just going to add on that. It's not just what Elizabeth was saying. You don't have to make perfect security, and the courts, the regulatory agencies, they keep that in mind. They're going to look at the volume and sensitivity of the information that you have, the complexity of your organization and your your data ops, and what is the cost of making it more secure than you are now? So don't be daunted by the idea that, we're a relatively small organization. We have 2 people in our ID department, and the cost of implementing security event and information management system is $50,000, the ones that we looked at. You may not have to meet that bar. So there are a lot of things that certainly every company they go to should be doing that they're probably not doing, but you don't have to design a perfect security. That's why in the law we use a reasonableness standard. So we're trying to match what is reasonable for your company to do, given the value of the data and the risk to both the company and maybe the individuals, if this is personal information data. How does that all match together? And were you doing something about it? And from a board standpoint, it's, did you even ask those questions? And did you follow up to see what the company is doing? Are you making any kind of progress if you had nothing to show for it in the beginning?
Right. No, that's a great point, Joel. And Elizabeth, one of the things that you touched on that we haven't really gone into yet is you talked about how we respond to things. So a lot of the things that we hear as a CIO is how do we respond to when we do have an incident, right? So those plans, those things, those responses that we have to be able to, when something happens, what are those things that we do? How important is a breach response plan, and what should we include in it?
I think that if a company has nothing else, it should have a written information security response plan. If that's all they can afford, they should have one of those that they test regularly. And as far as what should be included, all of my colleagues will have their expert opinion. And I think we would all agree that it should have roles, it should have resources, and it should have responsibilities, and it should all work together as a single team. But now more frequently, what I'm seeing from my clients is they're asking for us to help them draft separate plans just for ransomware, because the ransomware breaches are so different than some of the other ones, simply because of how long it may keep the company offline. There's so many press and consumer issues that arise, but I'll stop there, and I know everyone has their own idea.
So George, let me jump in here. So we'll venture the statement that everyone has an incident response plan. The question is whether or not it's actually documented, and whether it goes beyond the, oh my gosh, what do we do now? Which tends to be the reaction plan. The reaction plan is a really bad way to go, by the way, because at the last minute you are trying to improvise and figure out, oh, who do we need to tell? Oh, what do we need to do? And you tend to get things out of order. You tend to not include people that should be included. So, much as we do living on the Gulf Coast have, hurricane plans and things like that, you need a documented plan that says, when this happens, this is what we do. And it will be a living, evolving document, because as we find out more types of threats and more ways that we can become compromised, we will come up with more things that we need to include in this plan. And as our organizations mature and evolve, there will be more people that we will need to include in this. As the board becomes more aware, then the threshold at which we are notifying the board of specific incidents may change. And so those are types of things that will be living, breathing documents. And as Elizabeth said, it's extremely important that not only do you have a written plan, but that you also have different contingency plans. So in the case of a specific ransomware incident, this is what you would do. The more specific your plans can be, the more effective they can be, because you've thought through more of the contingencies ahead of time. So that's part of the value in having that incident response plan. One of the things that used to just bother me immensely was when you would have these very public breaches that would occur with Fortune 500 companies, and the CEO would do his official media statement, and the very first thing he was said would be, well, the very first thing that we did was we went and we hired a chief information security officer. So this will all be fixed now. And part of my thought was, you're a Fortune 500 company. Why didn't you already have an information security officer? So those are the types of things that, getting back to the board discussion and the reasonableness standard, you want to make sure that your organization has the key elements in place for a good foundation. And then you want to do the due diligence items, such as having a documented incident response plan that has different contingencies that you have as part of your plan, bringing in your general counsel, bringing in legal advice to make sure that you are protecting, as part of privilege, some of the investigation pieces. Those are things that you can think through very carefully ahead of time and share with your executive management so that everyone's on the same page. But in the heat of the moment, that will lead to a lot of tension and stress if you haven't thought through some of these things. So while everyone will be able to react, not everyone will be able to react well. And your job is to make sure that everyone is reacting in a reasonable standard.
I'd like to
So,
add.
Mayor, I'm going to go ahead and ask a real quick question, follow up on that. So I agree 100% with everything you said. You articulated very well. The one thing that you mentioned in there is there's so many different people involved in that process, right? So there's within your purview, you probably have hundreds or even more associated with that process. How do you communicate that and align everyone to understand exactly knowing what to do and when to do it?
So it's a combination of things. I mean, first of all, let's get back to the organization itself. Cyber is not the only way that an organization is going to have an incident that could impact the company. And so use similar standards as to other things. There are things, I'll give an example. So the university may have something that creates us as a center of attention for, a not necessarily positive reason, because of something that affects, one of the research areas or athletics or, something like that. The university already has, the people that need to be involved in those types of high level decisions, deciding who speaks to the media, at what point do we bring in law enforcement if that's something that needs to be done. Those things are already addressed in different situations. So cyber should be another aspects of that. So figure out what those processes are and make sure that you are in alignment with those processes. Now, being technology, you're going to have some unique elements, but you would have those unique elements regardless of the business unit, because every business unit is slightly different in different ways. So I would say, as much as possible, align yourself with what the organization is already doing in different ways. That also not only helps you identify the right people, but also gets you buy-in, because they understand what their role is in these other incidents, and therefore, even though it's a technology thing, they can understand what their role is in a cyber incident as well.
Okay, that's awesome. So Elizabeth, Joel, you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I wanted to say something about having a policy in place. Two things about that. A policy you can implement is better than no policy. But downloading a big policy that says all the covered areas and says what you're going to do about it, and publishing that without the ability to actually implement those things creates a huge amount of legal risk for the company, because you've made the claim that you're going to be doing certain things to protect the organization, and it turns out not to be true. And so you definitely want a policy, but don't go, do the areas as you can actually implement and follow up and do something about that. If you just start publishing policies about subject areas that you don't have the staff to do anything about, you've made a legal claim about what you're going to do. And if you fail to do that, and there's a breach that affects somebody else, that causes some kind of damage, that's your responsibility. And you've just, in effect, lied to the company, lied to the others by not doing that.
Absolutely.
So, to follow up on that, Joel, so one of the things that we've been told through different advisors and things is when you have that, it's better to set a minimalist policy and exceed it in action. But the stated policy would be more of a minimalist policy, so you can achieve that and go beyond. So if there's ever any question, that you can prove that, we even exceeded our own policies. Is there a relevance to that? Is that germane to this?
Well, I think so, but for an additional reason. When I write a policy in one particular area, what would be a good example? Administrative access to authentication systems should be done only with two-factor authentication. I'm just making that up as something that's embedded in a policy. I won't write in the policy how that's implemented, or I'll try to use the general terms. I want it to be an authenticated access by the administrator. Then you might have a procedure from the IT standpoint that implements that to in more detail, and probably or sometimes in a much higher standard than the way that I just described it. But that way you don't have to change the policy very often, and you don't have to try to explain what the exact implementation methodology means to the board. All you have to explain to them is, we have a policy that requires that these administrators have to go through an extra step to authenticate themselves before they can make changes to such and such critical systems. That's what they want to know. And that's the part of the policy they want to read. They don't want to read that you used a particular fob that rotates the one-time password every 30 seconds. What do they care? That doesn't help them make a decision about whether or not you're doing the right things to protect the company. So I keep it brief from a policy standpoint, because it makes it easier to adjust the implementation, and it makes it easier for the executive management of the board to understand what was your goal in this part of the policy area.
Right. Elizabeth, do you have anything to add to that?
I think we're all saying the same thing, but I think it's important to just reinforce that if you have a policy or if you have an incident response plan, it's worth nothing unless it's enforced, right, and tested. And so I think a big plug is appropriate here to recommend tabletop exercises on a regular basis. Even year over year, organizations realize, oh, so-and-so left, and now they don't realize until they get to the war room that the plan needs to be updated to account for a new communications person, or that the DevOps person has left. And so just having that exercise internally, it doesn't even have to cost anything, but just have it on the calendar, maybe as a half day for the annual board meeting, of going into the war room and testing that plan so that you can update the roles, update the responsibilities, and update the resources that are available.
And see if they can do the tabletop without logging into their network to get their instructions on how to do it.
Yeah.
Because if you have attack, you're not going to have your checklist.
We had a quick question from Gil, which he's talking about will the company be liable to customers as well, as opposed to just the board and other things? So I'm not sure which area he was asking that in, but so how does that appeal to what liability would the company have to customers?
Well,
it matters whether or not they have damage that they can identify.
Yeah, in California, there's a private cause of action now that consumers can bring against the company for failure to have a reasonable cybersecurity program if that's the reason for a breach. And so they will be directly liable when those class actions come about if they cannot establish that they had a reasonable cybersecurity program. In other cases, the attorneys general of all the states bring the action on behalf of the consumers. But especially in California, they can be directly liable to the customers.
And you need to keep in mind, those actions are going to happen based on where the person who suffered the damage lives. So if you're a Texas-based company and you're holding private information about California residents, it's the California law that you need to know about.
Mhm.
You have residents in the European Union member states, it's the European Union member states laws that you need to know about. Because when they come after you, they're going to do it on behalf of the individual that was harmed within their jurisdiction. And that's one of the things that makes it so difficult, because you've got 50 states of rules that are all slightly different. Sometimes only the attorney general can do something. Sometimes the individual who's harmed can come after you. They have different reporting time periods. They have different definitions of what is harm or what is a breach. And those are all kinds of things that somebody needs to do the advanced work to put the information as part of the overall information security plan. And have some people to go find out these things, so that you're not, like, my best example, I think it's Massachusetts. You have 2 weeks to give notification for a breach of private healthcare information. No, it's California, actually, I think. 2 weeks. If you're discovering that you had a problem, and it might take you 2 weeks to figure out how to even do the proper notification. And the same applies in the European Union. In some cases, you have to report to the data privacy officer in that member state within 72 hours for some instance.
Right.
If you're figuring that out at the time you have an incident, you're not going to make those time periods. That's why you do it in advance.
Yeah, and that's one of the difficult things from a CISO or a CIO perspective, because you have GDPR, which we have a few comments in here from Victor and others about the GDPR, which is international. But then we also have CCPA, we have New York Shield, we have so many different individual state mandates that we have to comply with. And it's kind of like, to know the least common denominator of what we need to do and how we need to approach that particular area is difficult. But we have about 7 minutes left, and I want to ask one last question. It's actually two questions combined. So it's really, one of the things is, how do we, because a lot of what we know as a CIO and being in executive management, cyber is a top-down thing. It has to be promoted at the top, and it has to verse throughout the entire organization. It has to be part of the culture. So a two-pronged question real quick. So how do we get the board more involved to create a culture of cyber, which obviously starts at the top? And as kind of an adjunct to that, what is the board member composition that we need to have to be able to ensure that they understand their obligations and to be forward thinking? Panel.
Well, I've been talking a lot, but it depends on the size of the company, the size of the board. Some boards have the financial wherewithal to bring in experts when they need it. And so you don't necessarily need somebody that has a high degree of knowledge in cybersecurity if you're in that situation when they have a lot of other issues. So they can bring in somebody that's disinterested in the company to kind of give them an evaluation, teach them the kind of things that they need to know in those areas. But that might not be true for a lot of boards. And I think if you're just if you're always asking questions, what are we doing? How does this apply to us next? And bring in the IT people, the CISO or equivalent, and say, don't tell me exactly what you're doing. Just tell me how that applies to us, so that I can make a decision about whether or not we're acting in the best interest of the company.
Yeah. So I'll jump in real quick, Elizabeth. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just real briefly. So kind of to evaluate or to go through that topic, our experience has been that when you don't have the right board makeup, when you don't have someone involved with at least technology and more preferably from a security perspective as well, the board really doesn't have that as part of their makeup. And then so when we talk about having the board more involved in creating a top-down approach and having it as part of the culture, they don't understand the importance associated with that, because we all know that it's more and more difficult nowadays, because most of the breach that we have and all the vectors for threats associated with this and vulnerabilities, a lot of it has to do with our people, right? So the culture has a lot to do with our cybersecurity preparedness. So from that perspective, Elizabeth, you're about to say something.
One of the experiences I had when I was in-house as a chief privacy officer is that challenge of how to get the message to come from the top down. So, and to create the culture. So what our team did was we worked with human resources and we added information security awareness and privacy awareness as 2 core competencies for annual reviews, so that all staff members throughout, whether they were manager up through the executive level, would be accountable for knowing information security and basic privacy practices to take care of the data that we were trusted with. A second item that we did to create accountability and is to have executive level information security and privacy training at the board level. So it was an hour long as opposed to a half day long. And that was an annual occurrence. And so it kept all the board members up to date. It kept them aware. It kept them sensitive to where the priorities were within the organization, like where to spend the most money for vulnerabilities, where to ask the questions about the roadmap to that reasonable security standard. So I think training and involving human resources and helping to establish a culture was critical to that transformation.
So I have 2 comments that I will make, kind of piggybacking on what everyone has said. So the first thing is that, at least in Texas, in the last legislative session, they did pass several regulations that require elected officials, other board members, to actually receive the cybersecurity awareness training. And so it is mandated now throughout Texas, for all state, local municipalities, things like that, that those people are required to do that. So kind of embracing the idea of regulations and outside entities are going to require your boards to have a certain level of understanding of what's going on from a cyber perspective. So that's one way that the conversation will be started, whether they particularly want to or not. The second piece to that is creating that culture. Part of it is leveraging. There are already people that talk to the board on a regular basis. Your general counsel is talking to the board on a regular basis. You have other executives within your organization that are doing this. If you can, on a regular basis, make sure that they are aware of what is your security program, what are the key risks, they will bring up some of those things to the board, and the board already sees them as trusted advisors. So rather than you having to make the case from a security perspective, here's why you need to listen to me, let others make that case for you. Present it in the terms that they understand. They are already presenting from their perspective the risk associated that the board needs to know about. Just make sure that they understand how cyber plays into the risk that you are dealing with and how they can use that as part of what they are sharing with the board. That will also help the board become more interested in overall, how does this impact the risk to the company?
Well, that's a great response. Did anyone have a final wrap up that they want to go forward? Because I think we have 1 minute left. No? Okay, so we really appreciate it on behalf of the panel, everyone attending today. I think that this has been awesome, helping you understand more about the board and their responsibilities towards cybersecurity and privacy. So, Umesh, I don't know if we have any gift cards or anything to give away, but whoever made the comment about Krispy Kreme donuts, that would be one of the choices for the gift card.
Of course I would be, right?
You just did that to console me for when I did it before. Thank you, Umesh.
Great content. Awesome. We will go ahead and find the person who has the Krispy Kreme comment. You like that? We will get them an e-card for Amazon gift card, $25. That is awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. Mary, Elizabeth, Joel, George, y'all did a phenomenal job. Thank you for everything you do for us in the community.